Dear students, I am here today in the TV studio of AIOU to talk to you on the first unit of your course, Educational Psychology. As you know that in educational settings, almost every teacher is confronted with the problem of individual differences in the classroom. The purpose of this program is to elaborate the concept of educational psychology. Today we will talk on the nature, scope and different methods of educational psychology in the field of education. Let's talk about nature of educational psychology. Educational psychology is one of the branches of applied psychology concerned with the application of principles, techniques and other resources of psychology to get solutions of the problems confronting a teacher attempting to direct the growth of children toward defined objectives. More specifically, we can say educational psychology is concerned with an understanding of the child, his development, his needs, and his potentialities. The learning situation, including group dynamics, the learning process, its nature, and the ways to make it effective. Stated differently, the central theme of educational psychology is psychology of learning. As an applied branch of fundamental psychology, it is the scientific study of human behavior in educational situation. It is concerned with those factors, principles, and techniques that relate to the various aspects of a child's growth and development. It is concerned with learning situation and process by which learning can be more efficient and effective. Educational psychology draws heavily from various branches of psychology, biology, sociology, and anthropology. Educational psychology is not as exact as natural sciences, since the human behavior cannot be predicted exactly because it is dynamic. Educational psychology is a science of education dealing primarily with how, when, and what of education. It is not a normative science as it is not concerned with the value of education and does not concern itself with what ought to be. It only describes what it really is. It is an applied positive science. While psychology deals with the behavior of all individuals in all walks of life, educational psychology limits its dealing with the behavior of the students in relation to environmental factors. Dear students, now we will look at how educational psychology contributes towards learning. This area is concerned with such problems, for example, how do children acquire skills? When is learning more effective? What are the factors that help the learning process? How do we measure the amount of learning? Are there any economic methods of memorizing? Why do we forget? Can memory be improved? Psychology helps teachers to get answer to these questions. It tells us that learning becomes more effective if factors like motivation and interest are taken into consideration by a teacher. The knowledge of psychology has helped teachers in modifying their approach to the teaching and learning process. Let's look at how educational psychology is facilitating teaching and learning in classrooms. 6 major areas covered by educational psychology are the learner, the learning process, the learning situation, the teaching situation, evaluation of learning performance, the teacher. Let's look at each of these briefly. First, we'll talk about the learner. Educational psychology deals with the techniques of knowing a student well. The topics studied in it include the innate abilities and capabilities of individual differences and their measurements, the overt, covert, conscious as well as unconscious behavior of the learner, and the characteristics of his growth and development at each stage, beginning from childhood to adulthood. Now let's talk about the learning process. After knowing the learner and deciding what learning experiences are to be provided, the emerging problem is to help the learner in acquiring these learning experiences with ease and confidence. Hence, it deals with the nature of learning and how it takes place and contains topics such as law, principles and theories of learning, remembering and forgetting, perceiving, concept formation, thinking, reasoning process, problem solving, transfer of training, ways and measures of effective learning, etc. Let's talk about learning situation. It deals with the environmental factors and learning situation that comes between the learner and his or her teacher. Topics like classroom climate, groups dynamic, techniques that aid learning, evaluating technique and practices, guidance and counseling come under this topic. Let's talk about teaching situation. It suggests that the techniques of teaching, it also help in deciding what learning situation should be provided by teacher to learner according to his mental and physical age, his previous knowledge and interest levels. Let's talk about evaluation of learning performance. The main objective of education is development of the learner. It includes cognitive and psychomotor aspect of personality. Educational psychology suggests various tools and techniques for assessment and evaluation, such as performance test, oral test, and written test. Let's talk about the teacher. Educational psychology emphasizes the need of knowing the self for a teacher to play his role properly in the process of education. It throws light on the essential personality traits, interests, aptitudes, the characteristics of effective teaching, so as to inspire, help teacher handle stress, conflict, and anxiety by giving insight from their own personality. Let's talk about the methods of educational psychology. In this section, I will describe the important methods of studying psychology of learning. Dear students, all methods of studying psychology of learning are basically methods of general psychology. Our brief review of the development of method will be helpful for you to understand the importance of the subject in greater depth. The first effort of conducting systematic experimental studies in psychology began in 1879 in Germany with the establishment of first laboratory of psychology by William Wundt. The next important method of collecting data came with the development of psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud, who emphasized the importance of unconscious mind in understanding behavior. In the second decade of the 20th century, psychology developed as an objective science of behavior by the efforts of Pavlov Watson. Experimental and observational methods were developed to collect data to study behavior. Simultaneously, testing movements started with the introduction of statistics in psychology.
Let's talk about behaviorism. We begin in late 19th century Russia, where scientist Ivan Pavlov lived with his dogs. Whenever Pavlov would bring the dogs their food, they would salivate. One day, he walked into the room without food and was shocked to see that the dogs were still drooling in anticipation. What Pavlov had accidentally discovered was the concept of classical conditioning. He didn't have to do anything to make those dogs drool when they saw food, but Pavlov wondered if he did something to make the dogs think they were getting food, could he make them drool whenever he wanted to? And that's just what he did. Pavlov first identified the stimulus, the thing that caused the dog's response or behavior. In this case, the stimulus was the food because it caused the dogs to salivate. Then he paired the stimulus with a separate incident, the sound of a bell. Every time Pavlov brought the dogs food, he rang a bell. Once the dogs got used to the sound of the bell at feeding time, Pavlov tried ringing the bell without giving the dogs any food. And voila, the dogs started drooling anyway. Pavlov had successfully trained the dogs to react to the new stimulus, the ringing of the bell, the same way that they reacted to food. Classical conditioning is a learning process that inspired behaviorism. By taking an unconditioned stimulus, the food that naturally caused the dogs to salivate, and combining it with something entirely neutral, the bell, he was able to remove the first stimulus and make something that was formally neutral elicit the conditioned response.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная. Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
We will now discuss some methods of educational psychology. First, experimental method, then observational methods, clinical methods, case study method. Let's talk about observational method first. Dear students, we observe so many things in nature. We also observe the action and behavior of others and form our own notion about these people. We look at other persons, listen to their talks, and try to infer what they mean. We try to infer the characteristics, motivations, feelings, and intentions of others on the basis of these observations. Let's talk about the steps of observational method. In the process of observation, following 4 steps are generally required. Observation of behavior, recording the observed behavior, analysis and interpretation of observed behavior, and finally, generalization. Now let's talk about the essential guidelines for making good observation. Observe only one individual at a time. The purpose of making observation should be clear to the observer. To have a real estimate of the true behavior of a person, it should be observed as frequently as possible. The observation should be made in differing and natural situations in natural settings to increase its validity. The observed facts must be recorded instantly, otherwise the observer may forget some facts. It is better to have 2 or more observers. Observation should be made under favorable conditions. There should not be any distraction or disturbances. Data from the observation should be integrated with other data. While arriving at the final conclusion about the individual, one should put together all that we know about the individual from other sources. Then we can give an integrated and comprehensive picture of the individual. Let's talk about the experimental method. Students, till now, we saw observational methods used in psychology of learning, but this method lacks scientific objectivity and validity. Experimental method is the most scientific and objective method of studying behavior. It is the method which is responsible for assigning the status of science to psychology. So let's learn more about this experimental method. In 1879, William Wundt established the first psychological laboratory at Leipzig in Germany. Ever since, the experimental methods has gained immense popularity. Experimental methods consist of actions performed under prearranged or rigidly controlled situations. Here the emphasis is on the experimentation. Experimentation is where the investigator controls the educative factors to which a group of children are subjected during the period of inquiry and observes the resulting achievements. Let's talk about the basic concepts or essential of experimental methods. Experiments are always conducted in laboratory. Hence, the laboratory is essential. Psychological experiments performed in this method essentially require 2 people: the experimenter who performs the experiment and the subject on whom the experiment is performed. The key factor in this method is the controlling of conditions or variables. The term variable means that which can be varied or changed. By controlling the variables, we can eliminate the irrelevant conditions and isolate the relevant ones. We thus become able to observe the causal relationship between the phenomena, keeping all other conditions constant. Let's talk about the steps in the experimental method. Dear students, let's now look at some of the steps in the experimental method. First, raising a problem. In any experiment, the first step is to identify a problem. For example, it has been observed that the students cheat in the examination. To stop it, many recommend strict supervision. But it has also been seen that even when there is a strict supervision, there is cheating. This problem may lead to experimentation. Let's talk about formulation of hypothesis. The next step in this method is the formulation of a hypothesis that strict observation may lead to less copying in the examination as compared to the relaxed supervision. This hypothesis is now to be tested by experiment. Let's talk about making a difference between independent and dependent variable. In the example quoted earlier, that the cheating behavior of the student will be dependent variable, while the nature of supervision will be the independent variable. It is because by changing the supervision, the cheating behavior is expected to change. In the present experiment, we manipulate conditions of supervision in order to discover the ways in which they determine the dependent variable, that is, the cheating behavior. Let's talk about controlling the situational variable. The experiment will not give valid results unless the situational variables are controlled. If the experiment is conducted with different sets of students who have been trained in a different manner and who have a different value system, then the results will be different in comparison to those who have been subjected to experiment earlier. Similarly, the other conditions, like the person who is supervising the place of supervision, have to be controlled. Let's talk about the analysis of the results. Once the experiment is concluded, the results are analyzed. In our example, we may apply some percentages to find out in which type of supervision a higher percentage of students have copied. Let's talk about verification of hypothesis. The last step in the experimental method is the verification of hypothesis, which we have earlier framed. The result of the experiment shows whether the hypothesis is accepted or rejected. Let's talk about clinical method. This method is primarily used to collect detailed information on the behavior problems of maladjusted and deviant cases. The main objective of this method is to study individual case or cases of group to detect and diagnose their specific problems and to suggest therapeutic measures to rehabilitate in their environment. It includes the following steps: interview, information gathering, hypothesis formulation, diagnosis, treatment program. Case study method. Case study is in-depth study of the subject. It is the in-depth analysis of a person, group, or phenomena. A variety of techniques are employed, including interviews, psychometric tests, direct observation, or archival records. Case studies are most often used in psychology in clinical research to describe rare events and conditions of the subject. It deals with the following problems: lack of interest in students, aggressive behavior in student, daydreaming, poor academic performance, emotional problems, social problems, empathetic understanding. Well, students, that was it for today. I hope that your concept about the introductory chapter to your course, which includes nature, scope, and various methods of educational psychology, are now clear. Until next time, goodbye from the TV studio of AIOU.